The NF Network is a patient advocacy organization, and we are pleased to partner with pharmaceutical companies. This exciting time in NF research is an accumulation results of all the efforts that the patient advocacy groups have done to fund NF research. The NF Network is very proud of the role we have played in obtaining over $380 million for federally funded NF research. As we have watched research go from basic science to translational and now clinical applications, we have seen the need to partner with the pharmaceutical companies. We are thankful that SpringWorks Therapeutics also saw the need. Early on, they worked with us to develop a clinical trial educational document to educate our families about your rights and what you can expect when participating in a clinical trial. We'll be sending out this instructional brochure to everyone who participates in this webinar this evening by email. The partnership with SpringWorks continues to be a valuable component for the NF Network as we move into the clinical trial stage. Tonight, I'd like to introduce you to an amazing team here at SpringWorks and let you tell them about the work they are doing, the opportunities to participate in research while SpringWorks develops therapies to help our NF families. SpringWorks Therapeutics is a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company that applies precision medicine approach to acquiring, developing, and commercializing life-changing medicines for underserved patient populations suffering from severe rare disease and cancer. Dr. Mary Smith is responsible for designing and running the clinical development programs. Prior to joining SpringWorks Therapeutics, Mary was the Executive Vice President of Gene Therapy at Bamboo Therapeutics, a wholly owned subsidiary of Pfizer, where she led several key gene transfer programs for rare genetic diseases. Prior to joining Bamboo, Mary was Vice President of Product Development at United Therapeutics, with responsibility for biological development in oncology, as well as regenerative medicine. Mary earned a PhD in microbiology, immunology from the University of New Hampshire and received her postdoctoral training at Emory University. Our next speaker will be Katie Stabler. She is the clinical program lead for Myrtimetinib and is responsible for overseeing the clinical trials operation for the program. Katie has over 14 years of experience in clinical trials and has been involved in clinical research of a number of rare diseases and oncology studies. Mike Weber is a clinical development lead for Myrtimetinib and has scientific oversight of the NF1 program, including the ReNeu study. Mike has spent his career focused on development drugs for various rare diseases and earned his Doctor of Pharmacy at Palm Beach Atlantic University with postdoctoral training at the University of North Carolina. And now I would like to turn it over to Dr. Mary Smith. Thank you, Dr. Smith, for joining us tonight.
Sorry, just have to get myself off mute. So thank you very much for having us tonight. It's really our pleasure to talk to you and tell you a little bit about SpringWorks and to walk through the development program for mirdametinib in NF1. If we could go to the next slide. I'll just take a moment to introduce you to SpringWorks. We are a clinical stage company that is focusing on targeted oncology. We currently have 10 clinical programs in 3 different oncology segments: rare tumors, hematologic cancers, and biomarker-defined solid tumors. We have 7 collaborations in large cancer indications and 2 late-stage rare tumor programs in potentially registrational trials that are supported with early promising clinical data. One of these late-stage programs is in Neurofibromatosis Type 1, and we'll walk you through this program this evening. If we go to the next slide. So on slide 6, let's discuss neurofibromatosis a little bit more generally. Neurofibromatosis, also known as NF, is a rare genetic disorder. There are 3 types of neurofibromatosis: neurofibromatosis type 1, type 2, and schwannomatosis. Approximately half of the individuals with NF1 or NF2 inherit the condition from one of their parents. The other half develop it as the result of a spontaneous mutation or change in one of the NF1 and in one of the NF genes. Neurofibromatosis type 2 is less common than NF1. It affects approximately 1 in 25,000 people worldwide. The disorder is characterized by the development of benign tumors called vestibular schwannomas on the nerve that carries sound and balance information from the inner ear to the brain. Most people develop symptoms in their late teens or early adult years, although about 10% of people can develop symptoms during late childhood. Neurofibromatosis type 1 is a rare genetic disorder that affects both children and adults. NF1 is the most common form of neurofibromatosis, and it affects anywhere between 1 and every 3,000 people, with approximately 100,000 patients living with NF1 in the United States. The clinical course of NF1 is heterogeneous, and it can manifest in a variety of symptoms across numerous organ systems. This can include abnormal pigmentation of the skin, skeletal deformities such as scoliosis, tumor growth, and neurological complications such as cognitive impairment. Moving to slide 7, just a little bit more about neurofibromatosis type 1. Plexiform neurofibromas are painful, disfiguring tumors that grow along peripheral nerve sheaths. Approximately, as I mentioned previously, 100,000 NF1 patients are in the United States. Of these NF1 patients, there is a 30 to 50% lifetime risk for these patients to develop this plexiform neurofibroma. NF1 plexiforms can malignantly transform into what's called an MPNST, or malignant peripheral nerve sheath tumor. And unfortunately, in this particular case, a diagnosis of MPNST portends a pretty poor outcome, with about the 12-month survival is under 50%. NF1 associated plexiform neurofibroma patients can present with a number of significant morbidities or things that are associated with their disease. NF1 mutations, as we mentioned before, again, this is a genetic disorder, and these mutations can cause the loss of a protein called neurofibromin. This protein is a key MAPK pathway repressor, and it can lead to these uncontrolled tumor growths across the body. And again, these PNs grow along nerves and can cause extreme pain and disfigurement. NF1 patients, as we've mentioned before, can experience neurocognitive deficits and developmental delays. This is why an agent that is able to penetrate the blood-brain barrier is very important to perhaps be able to affect some of these neurocognitive deficits. MEK1 inhibition this pathway has emerged as a validated target to treat NF1 plexiforms. Systemic therapy has been shown to be a clinical option for some patients. Next slide. So SpringWorks is developing a MEK1 or a MEK inhibitor called mirdametinib. Myrtimetinib is an oral allosteric small molecule inhibitor of both MEK1 and MEK2. And we've got a number of patients and subjects that have been exposed to date, over 250 in fact. We believe that the safety data and the anti-tumor activity that has been observed in a phase 2 investigator-led trial in both adolescents and adults with NF1 PNs supports further clinical evaluation. And I will walk you through the data of this phase 2 study in the next slide. Our compound has been granted a fast track designation by the FDA, as well as been designated with orphan drug designations, both by the FDA and the European Commission. And really what this means is that it allows for SpringWorks to have more frequent discussions with these regulatory agencies about the disease, about our clinical development program, and about our clinical trials in general. So we work in close collaboration with the FDA, for example, in the design of our studies. Myrtimetinib, as I mentioned, is an oral compound. It is dosed 2 times a day, and this can be taken regardless of when you take it. So it's independent of a need to fast. So mirdametinib can be given regardless of mealtime. It is also given on what's called a 3-week on, 1 week off cycle. So you take the agent for 3 weeks and then you have 1 week off. This intermittent dosing schedule has mitigated some of the toxicities that have been associated with MEK inhibitors as a class. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to just take the opportunity to walk you through the phase 2 study that was conducted by the Neurofibromatosis Consortium. This phase 2 study enrolled 19 patients with inoperable and symptomatic or growing plexiform neurofibromas. The age range that was included in this trial were between 16 and 39 years old with a median age of 24 years. Myrtimetinib was dosed at a dose of 2 milligrams per meter squared, up to a maximum of 4 milligrams, dosed 2 times a day, again, without regard to food, so you could give it at any time, and dosed intermittently, as I described, on a 3-week on, 1 week off schedule for a maximum of 24 cycles. And just to let you know, a cycle is about a 28-day period. So this was a trial that went on for about 2 years. The patients were on for 2 years. Of these 19 patients, 8 patients had achieved what's called a partial response. And if we look at what's called this waterfall plot on the left side of the graph, we can see that the majority of patients did have a shrinkage in their tumor, and this was measured by MRI. Of those patients, 8 had achieved what's called a partial response. In other words, they had a greater than or equal to 20% reduction in their tumor, again, as measured by MRI. The remainder of the patients had a stable disease. There was a number of PROs, or patient-reported outcome tools, that were used in this study. And these tools or measures showed statistically significant improvement with mirdametinib treatment in several areas. The first was in pain reduction. We did observe pain reduction for all patients on treatment by cycle 4. So again, after about 4 months of therapy. We also saw cognitive functional improvement for all patients on treatment at cycle 8. Again, this is after patients were on therapy for about 8 months. And we also saw overall quality of life improvements for patients who were in the group that had a partial response, and they achieved that by approximately cycle 8. When we consider the safety and tolerability of the compound, what we saw is the following. As I mentioned previously, the dosing schedule did minimize some of the historical classical MEK inhibitor toxicities, and those include rash, for example. However, in this study, one of the most commonly reported adverse events were rash, but these occurred at a grade 1 or 2. In other words, they were mild or moderate in this trial. Patients also suffered from fatigue and nausea, but again, at a mild or moderate frequency. We had no higher frequencies such as grade 4 or 5 events, and we only had 2 grade 3 treatment-related events reported, and those were pain occurring in a patient. 5 patients in this cohort of patients did require a dose reduction, but no patient discontinued the study due to dose-limiting toxicity. Again, the majority of patients were able to tolerate this dosing schedule pretty well. Now, building off of this data, SpringWorks is currently conducting a phase 2b trial in NF1 patients with plexiform, and Katie is going to walk you through that trial now.
Thank you, Mary. Next slide. So I have the pleasure to speak with you this evening to walk you through our current study that Mary had just mentioned. So the first slide is just to show you the study design, and I'll briefly go through what we are currently conducting here. So it is an open label pediatric and adult phase 2b study that we call the ReNeu trial. We're currently enrolling 100 patients in 2 different stratas. So we have a pediatric strata as well as an adult strata. And they are across about approximately 50 sites here in the US. As Mary had mentioned, we have an intermittent dosing of 2 milligrams per meter squared twice a day. So we have that 3 weeks on and 1 week off to give a little holiday, if you will, for the study drug. There's a maximum dose of 4 milligrams for that twice a day daily dosing. And our treatment duration is designed to evaluate a long-term benefit for mirdametinib for NF1 patients with the plexiform. The study duration is up to about 2 years of treatment. However, if patients are able to tolerate drug and still receiving benefit, they may maintain study treatment for as long as they and their doctor decide that they're still receiving benefit. So we do not have a cutoff for patients currently. We are looking at the study endpoints. Our primary endpoint or objective for the study is to look at the response rate, so how the tumor is responding to mirdametinib. And of course, we're also looking at the safety and tolerability of the drug for the patients and how long they are responding to the drug, as well as Mary mentioned earlier, the quality of life assessments for the study. So once a patient comes off study, I'm looking down at the bottom right hand of the slide, patients are on the study drug for as long as they are receiving benefit for hopefully at least 24 cycles. Patients will be followed for a safety follow-up for 28 days after that treatment. All right, next slide, please. So to give you a little bit of an overview of where we currently are for the study, we began enrolling in October 2019, and we anticipate closing our enrollment for the study this year. Our adult stratum is a bit more ahead of the pediatric stratum, and we're anticipating closing enrollment hopefully pretty soon for that stratum. Our pediatric is a little bit further behind because we had written in additional safety analysis for our pediatric patients. And so we had first 5 pediatric patients, which were ages from 9 to 17 years of age, were administered at least 2 cycles, that's the 28 days, 2 months of treatment for mirdametinib. After those 5 pediatric patients had received at least the 2 cycles, we had a safety analysis for those 5 pediatric patients, which was conducted in April of last year of 2020. Our safety committee, or as we call it, our data monitoring committee, concluded that these 5 pediatric patients had a favorable safety profile that was comparable to adults. And they recommended we should proceed with the study for pediatrics to enroll from 2 years of age and above. This also was aided in the availability of a pediatric formulation, which I'll talk about at a later slide. Currently, we have over 45 sites activated in the US and enrolling for our clinical trial. And later on, we'll go through where you can find a center that might be close to you if you would like to participate on clinicaltrialsgov. All right, next slide, please. So a little bit more about our study. As I mentioned, participation is approximately 2 years, but can be more. Everyone on the study does receive our active study drug. So we do not have any patients participating that are on placebo. We have the 2 different forms of mirdametinib. There's a capsule formulation and a dispersible tablet for patients who can't swallow a capsule easily. As Mary had mentioned, you can take our study drug without regard to food. And then our dosing again is 3 weeks on and 1 week off. Our side effects that we have most commonly been reported in our phase 2 trial that Mary had just mentioned are very common to all MEK inhibitors, and it's nausea, vomiting, rash, diarrhea, and fatigue. We are monitoring all patients for these and all side effects during our study. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in order to be eligible for this study, we have various criteria. So inclusion criteria is what criteria you must have to be eligible for the study. So in order to be a participant, a patient must be 2 years of age or higher. You have to have either a clinical diagnosis of NF1 or have a constitutional NF1 mutation documented. A patient must have a PN that causes significant morbidity, and they also must have a targeted PN that cannot be completely surgically removed. We're also looking at the target tumors by volumetric MRI analysis. Therefore, a patient has to have a tumor that we can measure fully by MRI. Adult patients are asked to have a tumor biopsy, and pediatric patients do not have to go through a tumor biopsy for this study. And of course, we're always checking for the safety. So we look at participants that have adequate organ and bone marrow function. So we test their blood samples and urine for those functions. Next slide. So some additional criteria that would exclude a patient from the study. So I'll just touch on a few key items here. So a patient cannot have an active optic glioma or other low-grade glioma requiring treatment. A patient cannot have received a NF1 PN targeted therapy within 45 days before entering our study. And also a patient cannot have received previous or currently receiving any previous MEK inhibitor treatment in order to be eligible. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So as I mentioned, one of the great advantages to mirdametinib is the fact that we do have a dispersible tablet formulation. So those patients, especially the pediatric patients that are unable to swallow a full capsule, we do have this dispersible tablet. So this slide just shows a picture of a handout for dosing instructions that we give our patients to help them walk through how to disperse the tablet into water. So the tablet is placed into a syringe, and then you fill it up with about 5 milligrams or 5 milliliters rather of water. And then it is administered orally, just like the capsule is. So next slide. Oh, and I also should mention that it is grape flavored, and we have been told that it tastes very good. So next slide. All right. So I won't read through this slide. The next slide actually has a picture of the patient journey. So thank you, advance this one. So just kind of walk you through, what does it look like to come into our study? So first and foremost, you will meet with your doctor, and they'll go through what we call an informed consent. It's a document that kind of walks you through exactly what to expect for your visits. What are we trying to accomplish with our study, and past risks and so forth. So if you have any questions when you're reading that document, always ask your doctor those questions, and make sure you fully understand the study and what you're signing to participate in. So once you sign the informed consent, we will start the eligibility review for you. So there's a 45-day window for screening. And during that screening visits, you'll have safety assessments. We'll ask you questionnaires about how you're feeling. You'll have an MRI, as I mentioned earlier, an ECG, and so forth. So we just want to make sure that you are eligible, and this trial is beneficial and safe for you as much as we can be. Once you have checked your doctor has checked your eligibility for the study, you will begin your study treatment. As we mentioned, that's the 28-day cycles, about 4-week cycles. And then during those cycles, you'll attend various visits for our study. So the first cycle, you have 2 visits, and then the second cycle, you also come in. And then during those visits, you'll have like physical exams, blood tests, urine test. In most visits, you'll also have a patient questionnaire. It'll be asked about your disease, your symptoms, your well-being. And approximately every 4 cycles, you'll have a visit that will also include an MRI, heart assessment, eye exams, strength, and range of motion tests. And every month that you don't have a visit at the clinic, your study doctor or nurse will call you just to check in, to make sure, a wellness check to make sure you're doing okay. And once you've completed study treatment, as I mentioned, you will attend this safety follow-up visit. It's actually 30 days after your last dose. Next slide, please. So how do you know if you or your child are eligible for our ReNeu clinical study? You might be eligible if you have a diagnosis of NF1 and PN that cannot be completely surgically removed and that has a negative effect on you or your child's quality of life. If your potential participant is 2 years of age or older. There's also additional eligibility criteria, some of which I've mentioned earlier. So if you're interested, you should speak to your study doctor, to see if this is a right fit for you. And as I mentioned, it's the easiest place to go and find your study doctor that's participating near you is to go to clinicaltrials.gov. And we'll show you a little bit how to walk through and find our study. So when you log into clinicaltrials.gov, they have that identifier number that is also on that slide, and you can pull up right to our study. And as you can see on this web page, there's a lot of information about the study, a brief summary. There's a little bit of the criteria that we have gone through this evening. But if you scroll all the way to the bottom of the web page, you can see the contact information and locations. So it is filtered by state and alphabetically. So if you could just scroll down to your state, and you can find a doctor that's closest to you. It also shows if the center is currently active and recruiting on the right-hand side of the website, or if they are going to soon be joining our study. And back to the slides. Thank you. I think that was my last slide. And yes, and so now I'll hand it over to Dr. Mike Weber, who is going to go through a bit of data of our current study.
Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. I'm going to briefly describe a first look at the data from the phase 2b ReNeu study that Katie just discussed. And this is based on a data cut that was taken in January, on January 22nd of 2021. The data that I'm presenting describes the first 20 adult patients that were enrolled in the ReNeu study. The median age of these adults was about 33 years old, with patients ranging from 19 to 69, with the majority of these patients having a target plexiform that is in either their head and neck or one of their lower extremities, so their legs. All of these adult participants had a plexiform that was causing them symptoms that were impacting their daily life. For example, all of the adults that I'm discussing had pain that was associated with their plexiform, and half of these patients had a plexiform that was causing them to have problems either moving their arms or their legs, or was disfiguring to them. Of these 20 adults, 16 of them, or 80%, remained on study at the time of this data cut. And the median, approximately the average time that patients were treated was about 10 months. For the 4 patients that did discontinue, they discontinued because one of them had mild diarrhea, one had progressive disease, meaning their plexiform got a little bigger on study, withdrawn consent, meaning the patient decided they did not want to be in the study anymore, and one person that had to have metal rods implanted due to their scoliosis, which meant they no longer could be in the study. Of these 20 adults, 50% of them, so 10 out of the 20, did experience a partial response, which means that their plexiform shrank by at least 20%. Myrtimetinib has been generally well tolerated in these 20 adults, with most adverse events being mild to moderate, with the most common adverse events being rash in 90% of these adults, nausea in 50%, and diarrhea in 45%. There has been one severe adverse event related to mirdametinib in these 20 adults, and this was a severe rash. Importantly, there have been no life-threatening adverse events or deaths that have occurred in any of these 20 adults. We are encouraged by these results, and we do hope to be presenting additional data in the near future. That's all I had. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're happy to take any questions that you might have. And Kim, I didn't know if you wanted to read off any.
I would be glad to if I could get unmuted. Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. So there's one question so far. First, I want to say thank you to everyone. What a really enlightening webinar tonight. And the question that's come in is, how many additional pediatric participants is SpringWorks looking to sign up for the trial?
Yeah, so it's hard to give very specific numbers. I will say that we are still enrolling the pediatric cohort at this time. The reason why I say that is because we do have a number of patients dosed, and sometimes we have a number of patients in screening. So we're in that process that Katie was talking about, where they're going through and they're having all of their assessments done. And sometimes when you go through the screening, you may find that there is a condition or a finding that will make you ineligible for the study. So that's why I don't want to give you specific numbers, because it may be misleading. But all I can say is that we're still looking for a good handful of pediatric patients. So if you're interested, like Katie had mentioned, going to clinicaltrialsgov is the best way to is the best way to find out information in a site near you.
Thank you, Mary. So here's a question, and I would like to add just a little bit to it. When they're asking, how is the quality of life assessed? And then I'd like to add to that question, you had mentioned that cognitive function had improved earlier. I wondered if that was being measured in this study as well.
Yeah, so the way that cognitive function in general was measured, it was based off of the types of questions that are in these patient-reported outcomes. So depending on the way the way that the question is asked, you might be able to infer some changes in cognition. So we do not have a patient-reported outcome that is specifically looking at cognitive changes, but certain questions within these patient-reported outcomes do give an indication of potential changes. And I hope that answers the question. Mike, do you have anything more to add on that, since you know much more specifically about the PROs that are being collected?
Yeah, well, that was specific to some cognition. I would say in general in the study, There's a few different ways that quality of life is assessed, in a way dependent on how that plexiform is affecting a patient when they come on to study. Of course, we do have questionnaires that are either asking the patient or potentially the caregiver of the patient how their overall quality of life has changed. But if, for example, a participant came on to study with pain, we're also going to ask about that pain, how that's changed over time, how maybe changes in that pain has affected their life, in hopefully a positive way with reduction in that pain while on study. And kind of building off of that, we also understand that some people have plexiforms that make it harder to move their arms and their legs, or in overall mobility and getting around. So not only do we measure the strength and the range of motion of some patients on study, but we also have some PROs specifically asking about how has your mobility changed? Are you able to carry in groceries from the car easier than you used to? There's a lot of different questions like that to try and understand how your plexiform affects you, and if we're hopefully seeing any positive changes while you're on study.
Thanks, Mike.
We have a question from Michael. He says, thank you for the presentation. And this is a really good question. In the trials, has mirdametinib been shown to reduce the frequency of NF1-PN conversions to MPNSTs?
That's an excellent question, and unfortunately, we don't have an answer to that. We're not actually assessing that as part of the clinical study, and I think I can actually see the rest of that question. So the sample size is relatively small, and as you can imagine, because of the lifetime risk of the conversion or the transformation of a plexiform to an MPNST, because it only occurs in a very small subset of patients, it would be very difficult. You would need a very large study to be able to look at that specifically. Obviously, if we did see any, actually at that point, you would have to look to see if you had a conversion to an MPNST. So hopefully that answers your question. We're not specifically tracking that. And again, I think you brought up the point about the small sample size and the duration that you would have to be able to track it.
Thank you. Somebody else, Roxanne, is asking, if you have metal near the plexiform, are you able to participate?
I think the issue with the metal rod, for example, in the case of the scoliosis, is that it interfered with the MRI. So it makes the MRI not accessible.
Yeah, so I would just say, to build on that, it's really going to be up to a discussion, like we said, with your doctor, in understanding if you are able to undergo MRIs that will be looking at that plexiform while you're on study. That's really what that comes down to.
Yep.
Thank you. Here's another good question. This one's from Sharon. How is this different than Myrtimetinib or other MEK inhibitors?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So I think, just as a general statement, MEK inhibitors, they are the same in that they inhibit what's called this MEK, okay? And it's all part of the pathway, but not all MEK inhibitors are exactly the same. I think that if we think about mirdametinib, for example, and some of the differences to selumetinib, we think of things like potency. So some drugs can be dosed at a lower dose because they are a more potent compound. So that's one example of a difference, for example, between mirdametinib and selumetinib. Another thing you can see sometimes is that some drugs have what's called drug interactions. So in other words, or they have different absorptions. And in other words, you have to, in the case of some of these MEK inhibitors, you actually have to fast before you can take the drug. So the drug has to be given on an empty stomach. And then you also can't eat after you take the drug for a certain amount of time, because you need to have nothing in your stomach for that drug to get absorbed. So that's another difference. Whereas with mirdametinib, for example, you can take the drug independent of food. So you could take it right before you eat, or you could take it right after you eat. And sometimes that actually helps with, some of the side effects, the gastrointestinal type of side effects, for example, if you can take your medication with food. So those are just some of the differences. So they hit the same target, but there are some very significant differences between the drugs sometimes in some of these characteristics. Hopefully that answers your question.
I think it does. Thank you. There's another one that's just rolled in here. I have a plexiform tumor or tumors that are inoperable. I also have eye issues. I have read that it could cause blindness. So is there a drug that I could use?
So I'm thinking you're saying that a MEK inhibitor can cause blindness. And I will say that MEK inhibitors as a class have been associated with ocular toxicities. So I think this would be a question more suited for your treating physician, who can really help guide a treatment protocol specific for your particular condition.
Thank you. And now one from Maria. This is the last one that I have here this evening. Is there still a way to sign up? I know we showed the clinical trial spot and it has the phone number on it, but I also want to encourage anybody who's on the webinar this evening, if they have additional questions, feel free to give us a call at the office, or you can easily send us an email at admin@NF Network, and we can help step you through that process. So to make sure you get the proper connection.
That's correct. Yes. Again, going to a site and talking to one of the participating, they're called principal investigators. You could also talk to your doctor to discuss the trial, and they might be able to help as well.
Well, a couple more questions have rolled in here. Do you mind taking a few more?
Of course.
Michael says, are the side effects occurring in the same rate or frequency in the pediatric group as in the adult group?
I mean, that's a good question. I would say that we do see some differences in the frequency of some of the adverse events, but the trial is we're still assessing the adverse events and the frequencies at this point. We've done, like I said, we've done an initial data cut of those adult patients, and we will be getting ready to do another data cut for the pediatrics as well, so we can more specifically answer that question.
Thank you. And there's another one here from Ryan. Is the food variable that you spoke of indicate that the absorption of the mirdametinib different than the selumetinib or other MEK inhibitors?
Yes, that would be the characteristics, right? So depending on, again, the way, and I think you've just hit the nail on the head, the way that the drug is absorbed when you take it orally can impact, for example, the exposures of the drug. So exposures can change based on whether or not you have food in your stomach at the time that you take the drug or not. So yes, there are differences in those characteristics, and mirdametinib specifically, as I mentioned, is able to be taken with or without food.
Thank you. Another one has come in from Joan. Joan, you say that you do not have an NF doctor and you live in a state that does not have any NF experts. So you're 63 years old, and you said so time is not on your side. Joan, I'd like to encourage you to give us a call at the NF Network office tomorrow. In the chat, you can see our phone number, 630-510-1115. Give us a call tomorrow and we'll help walk you through that process of making sure that you get connected with an NF expert that's as close as possible to where you live. And then we have Ryan. Are you exploring other delivery methods other than orally?
We are not currently exploring that. And I'm assuming maybe you're thinking about topical. I'm not sure what other delivery methods, maybe IV, but right now we just have an oral formulation. Again, as Katie walked you through, it's either as a capsule or a dispersible tablet, which would allow you to actually drink it after you dissolve the disposable tablet in water.
And Blake is asking, is this new medication available outside of the United States?
It is currently not. However, we have been exploring the potential to open a site or two in Canada, but that is still that still remains to be seen. So right now it is only available in the United States as part of the clinical trial.
Well, thank you, Mary. I think we've wrapped up all the questions now. Thank you so very much for staying on and fielding these questions for us and for giving of your time this evening to let us all know more about the study that you're doing there. Thank you so very much. The hope that you give our families is greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.